If you were to look up the word actuation in the dictionary, it would point you towards the precise moment that a piece of machinery or any kind of process starts to work. That moment of inception where you pull the chain of your chainsaw and it starts buzzing and whirring, that's actuation. But in philosophy, the idea is rather different. And in Berserk, the term is used entirely devoid of its textual context, because actuation is the name of a sword. Yes, that's right, strugglers. It's time we spoke about perhaps the coolest and most important sword in Berserk that isn't Dragon Slayer, Skull Knight's Sword of Actuation. This Behelit-coated piece of astral annihilation can tear open space itself with a single swing, and while its powers are impressive, you can't just use it in a battle willy-nilly. The Sword of Actuation is perhaps the most powerful magical artifact in Berserk as of this moment, and as with everything else in the series, there is a reason for that. But what exactly is that reason? Does the sword live up to the hype we've created? And what will be the blade's purpose as Berserk draws closer to its climax? We'll answer all those questions and more in this video. This is Skull Knight's Sword of Actuation Explained. In its regular form, it's a thorny monstrosity, though its effectiveness against astral creatures is undeniable. Skull Knight's sword and its cutting power. In our Skull Knight armor video, we spoke about the significance of the armor and its relation to his very existence. It was important because, in a way, that armor is what's keeping him alive, despite it being described as a coffin by its creator, presumably because it hosts Skull Knight's dead soul. This video is going to be a little different because the Skull Knight's sword isn't nearly as integrated into his very being as his armor. Nowhere did Hanar make mention of the sword being an integral part of his anatomy, and in fact, it's highly presumptive to assume that the sword was even made by the Dwarven smith in the first place. It's highly likely that this sword is actually a relic from Skull Knight's previous life as King Geiserik, owing purely to one scene that we see in the Golden Age movies. Now, yeah, a lot of you don't like these movies, and there is certainly a lot to be said about the way it is animated and some of the alterations it makes to what happens in the story, like Guts actually freeing himself from Borkov before being pinned down again during the eclipse, which was a great dramatic addition, but you'll still hear Berserk fans complaining about it because it wasn't accurate down to the last detail. However, the implication that Skull Knight was Geiserik is actually one of the additions we don't mind. Not just because we're proponents of the theory, but also because they use the sword to make the connection. The first time we see Skull Knight's sword is in a flashback to Geiserik's era in these movies, so when he comes to rescue Guts and Casca, we immediately know whom to think of when we see him. But having spoken about its alleged historical significance, let's talk about the sword itself, because even in its base form, it's a haunting piece of work. It's easy to miss if you're not looking for it, but the Skull Knight's sword makes its debut right alongside him. It was simply sheathed in such a way that its outline wasn't evident. The first time we see him draw the blade is in chapter 52, when he shows up out of nowhere, as he does, to save Rickert from an unprompted apostle attack, as he does. When the apostles don't heed his first warning, he draws his blade, and you can immediately see that it's rather different from any ordinary sword. Instead of tapering off to form an edge or having a wide blade like Dragon Slayer, the tip of Skull Knight's sword is shaped like a massive arrowhead, kind of like the Mainz-type gladius swords from the Roman Empire. Its crossguard makes it look like a thorny schiavona, with spiked edges coming out of the base of the sword to where its crossguard ends. Such a disproportionate blade would usually be unwieldy, especially against monsters like apostles, but somehow the Skull Knight makes it work to great effect. His first on-page act with his thorny sword is to slash off Nosferatu Zod's arm with no effort. Just think on that for a moment. When Godot gifts Guts a regular longsword to carry on his journey, it managed to smash through another sword and part of Godot's anvil, but it breaks the second time it hits the Hound Apostle. Skull Knight's blade is about the same size in terms of dimensions, yet he could use it to cut through apostles like he was mowing grass with a lawnmower. He showed up at the eclipse, took a stab at Big Dog Void, avoided the deflection, and then cleared the field before escaping with Guts and Casca in tow. What's even more impressive is the fact that he did it all with a thorny grip, which Guts realizes when he is given Skull Knight's sword to fend off his first Night of Terrors. A thorny grip is as counterproductive as it sounds, given the fact that it injures its user before anyone else. But you have to remember that Skull Knight is a literal horse-riding set of armor. Pain is nothing to it. In fact, the thorn grip probably helps him use the sword better, as it remains in place by getting into the nooks and crannies crannies of his gauntlets and locking itself in place. The same would be true for Guts' hold over the sword during that first night, but he wasn't even the Black Swordsman yet, let alone having the literal loss of feeling that Berserker armor Guts is currently suffering through. The thorns have an underlying thematic importance as well, because if you've seen our Skull Knight armor video, which you should if you haven't, you'll know that roses and thorns are a major part of his characterization and character design. The Skull Knight's shield is emblazoned with a rose crowned in thorns, and now we learn that his sword has a thorn thing going on as well. It's further confirmation that this is a relic from Geiseric's past because of the established magical role that thorns and vines play in Berserk. The first weapon that Farnace learns how to manipulate with her magic is the blessed vines she receives from her mistress Shirke, who herself was a disciple of Flora, Skull Knight's friend. We don't think it's a coincidence that thorns are such an important visual motif in the Skull Knight's character design, so it makes sense that his sword too would carry on the trend. And when you consider the fact that it took Guts' Dragon Slayer to start hunting down apostles, when Skull Knight has been doing it for a millennium with this sword that looks eerily similar to the one he cracked on the Hound Apostle, you start to gain a whole new appreciation for the cutting power of Skull Knight's sword. Its blade is on par with Dragon Slayer in terms of its power, yet its maneuverability is about the same as the saber that Griffith carries with him everywhere, which is to say, extremely agile. In the hands of a skilled warrior, it is an unstoppable death machine, which is exactly why we think of Skull Knight as an unstoppable death machine. Yet, however baffling it might be for you to believe, this all pales in comparison to what happens when Skull Knight swallows his sword. And no, we don't mean that with any innuendos. We mean it quite literally. Why does the Skull Knight eat Behelits? To kill the God Hand, of course. How Skull Knight's Sword of Actuation answered one of Berserk's biggest mini-mysteries. If you were a Berserk fan reading the manga weekly back in 1998, you'd have probably asked yourself the question we are about to pose to you. Why the heck does Skull Knight keep eating Behelits? The first time we see him carry out this odd behavior was in chapter 118. After Guts defeats Rosine and leaves part of the Misty Valley a blasted ruin, the Skull Knight arrives hot on his heels. He remarks that it appears as though hellfire had scorched the land, but he is well aware that it was in fact Guts who did this. He thinks to himself that evil fortune has not yet deserted the struggler. The destruction and dead bodies in front of him were proof of that. Yet, he wondered, how long could Guts, as nothing more than a man, continue on his troublesome path? His thoughts were interrupted by something he noticed hidden inside the base of a tree stump. He reaches in, and out comes a Behelit. Rosine's Behelit, to be precise, because as you might know from our Crimson Behelit Origins video, Behelits don't exactly disappear after being used once. The Skull Knight then does something entirely unexpected for us. We've never seen him eat food or go for a drink, but as we've known from the beginning, he's undead in some capacity. But to see Skull Knight gulp down a Behelit like he was eating a boiled egg whole was just one of those things that becomes unintentionally funny. When we first read this, we thought, hey, that's cool. Good to know even Skull Knight needs to get his protein from somewhere. But if you were one of the people we referred to at the beginning of this section, then you might have wondered just why the Skull Knight was eating Behelits like a morning snack. This question would pop up again during the Conviction arc, where the Skull Knight once again ingests a Behelit, this time the one presumably belonging to the egg of the perfect world. Again, no context is provided for his actions, which take place in the middle of the incarnation ceremony no less, which only adds to the intrigue. Why was he eating Behelits? Was he getting some kind of weird powers from them? Were they being locked away in his undead guts so no one else would find them? Are they the only things he can digest? Well, turns out the answer to all of those is both yes and no. See, the Skull Knight ingesting Behelits does seem weird at first glance, but when you consider the fact that this guy's every move is planned, you start to realize maybe he has a plan after all. When you see him do it a second time, the idea only becomes stronger, and 5 years, lo and behold, your suspicions have paid off in the most rewarding way possible. We're still referring to those of you who read chapter 118 in 1998, because the explanation for why SK eats Behelits comes in chapter 221, which was released in 2003, a whole 5 years after we first saw him do it. When Guts entered Kliphoff, he was looking to save Farnace and Casca from a gang of trolls. The last thing he expected to be doing is going up against a partially manifested Slan, yet that's exactly what he found himself doing. Guts' inner beast welcomed the challenge of a physical fight with a god hand, but his physical body itself was nowhere near capable of withstanding the inhuman amounts of pain that every move of Slan's was putting him. The slash she gives him across his chest as she took off his armor to make him defend defenseless is one whose scars remain prominent across Guts' flesh to this day, and she basically has him beat, until the Skull Knight starts running interference. The Wandering Wraith shows up out of nowhere, once again, and starts cleaning house whilst trash-talking Slan to her face, or rather her womb, because that's what she kept calling Clipoff time and time again. Skull Knight's war with Slan's children distracts her long enough for Guts to fire off a cannon shot at point-blank range, but despite burning a hole through her, it only manages to excite Slan. Skull Knight then urges Guts to run her through with his Dragon Slayer, and he does, but it ends up causing the domain she'd brought with her to crumble into chaos. With Clipoff disintegrating around them, Guts and Skull Knight were basically trapped with no way out. That's when Skull Knight decided to create a way out for them and lowered his sword down his skeletal throat. What emerged is the most impressive and terrifying weapon we've seen in Berserk to date. And yeah, that's counting Rickert's medieval bazooka, you guys. A last resort to seal the God Hand, but otherwise a handy space warping tool. How Skull Knight's Sword of Actuation works. As Clipoff was crumbling into the astral ether, Guts started losing his cool because he could no longer see an exit. He began searching for it in a panic, while the Skull Knight muttered something about testing out a thing he was planning to reserve for the God Hand. Guts thinks the Skull Knight is some sort of street magician clearly, because he tells the Wandering Wraith that magic like swallowing his sword whole wasn't going to help them here. But then his eyes widen at what emerges from the Skull Knight's throat. When his sword had gone in, it had been a normal blade. Epically powerful, but nonetheless normal. After the Skull Knight swallowed it and took it out, it emerged coated with multiple Behelits that he had been collecting from fallen apostles all these years. This is the part where Skull Knight explains his odd taste for astral artifacts as well. Turns out, he wasn't eating the Behelits so much as he was refining them into a congealed and pliable mass within his own infernal gut. Whenever the Skull Knight would swallow his sword, this mass would coat itself on the blade and turn it into what the Dark Horse translation calls the Sword of Actuation. The actual Japanese translation of the kanji for this sword is Sword of Pump Priming, and no, once again, this isn't an innuendo of any kind. See, Behelit is not a word in the Japanese dictionary. It's actually a Syrian origin term for the devil. So, in order to make it work within the context of his story, Kentaro Miura alternatively referred to these artifacts as Behelits and primed droplets throughout his story. That second description is what is more relevant for this video, because those primed droplets are the ones being referred to in the kanji for the Sword of Actuation. Its literal translation should be Sword of Behelits, but Actuation actually works out pretty well for its description, as you'll see in a few moments. When Guts first sees the sword, he is both shocked and concerned, and with good reason. He knows personally just how much pain and despair is locked within a Behelit. He's been carrying one with him since the first arc of the series, and indeed, when the Skull Knight pulls out his Sword of Actuation, the Behelit in Guts' satchel starts rearranging its face as if it were being summoned to be used. Before he can ask what exactly the sword was made out of, the Skull Knight explains what the sword was, names it as the Sword of Actuation, and then slashes down at the heart of the Clipoff domain without uttering another word. Guts is shocked to see the abyss appear out of the sword slash that Skull Knight just performed, but to be fair, his hearing has always been slightly off. As he was engulfing his sword with the evil essence of the Behelits, Skull Knight explained to us that he only meant to use this as a final measure against the God Hand. Its explicit purpose was to entomb them in that vortex, and as a matter of fact, Skull Knight hadn't even tested the sword out yet. This abyssal slash, which immediately devoured every ogre and troll that had spawned within the chaos of Clipoff crumbling, was the first time he had actually used the sword himself, and it worked out perfectly, given what we just said happened to those trolls and ogres. But this presented another problem for our struggling duo. They were trapped within a cave. Skull Knight might have banished the evil astral creatures to Berserk's version of hell, but unless he had another trick up his sleeve, he and Guts were about to join those creatures as well. This is when the Skull Knight demonstrated the second power of the Sword of Actuation. As soon as Guts realized the danger he was in, Skull Knight grabbed him and put him on his horse. He then slashed open another spatial portal, and then we see both him and Guts standing near Shirkei's group, which had splintered off from him earlier in an attempt to escape. Guts is just as baffled by this development as we were, but once again, Skull Knight, the expositional god, explains that they just cleaved space and passed through another layer to get to where they were. He says that that was the power of the sword, and as usual, Guts is confused by the Skull Knight's context-lacking explanations, but we got what the Wandering Wraith meant. As you will learn in our Behelit anatomy video, which should drop sometime soon, so make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell to always on because you don't want to miss that, the inside of a Behelit is essentially connected to the abyss itself. When a Behelit is activated by a human being, it opens a fissure in their soul. Should they choose to accept the God Hand's proposal of apostlehood, once the requisite sacrifice has been made, that fissure is filled with the essence of evil, which itself is directly siphoned from the abyss. That's why when an apostle dies, the ground beneath them cracks open and their souls are dragged into the abyss, leaving only their mortal flesh behind. Basically, what we're trying to say is the Behelit is a key to the abyss which is normally only activated when certain conditions are met, but the Skull Knight exploited its immense astral power and his own knowledge of the art of Arcana to bypass those requirements and forge the sword into a blade that can cleave open space seemingly at his command. It also appears as though the Skull Knight can manipulate the degree to which he opens space itself, as his first sword stroke sent those trolls and ogres straight to hell, but his second one brought him and Guts out of Kliphof. If every slash sent its target to the same place, then it would mean Guts and Skull Knight passed through the abyss somehow, which is impossible because Guts would have never been able to leave the abyss once caught thanks to his brand of sacrifice. Guts is still a sacrifice for demon kind, and we were told in the first arc of the series that the fate of all those who get tangled with demons is to end up in the abyss, whether they be sacrifices like Guts and Teresia or apostles, like Teresia's dad. So it only stands to reason that the Sword of Actuation can cut through multiple layers of the astral world and allow Skull Knight to navigate that space using his inhuman spiritual perception. The Wandering Wraith departs the scene just as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving Guts more indebted to him than ever, and us salivating for more Sword of Actuation action than ever. Sadly, we'd have to wait at least 5 more years for it to come back into play, and what it managed to accomplish in its second appearance was even more baffling than what it did in its first, but that isn't entirely down to the sword's powers. Causality was involved this second timer. Can the Sword of Actuation actually entomb the God Hand? Why Skull Knight's Behelit sword is the key to defeating fate in Berserk. The second and final time we see the Sword of Actuation come out to play is during the climactic battle of the Millennium Falcon arc. Griffith rides Zod to the top of Emperor Ganishka's head, who is ballooned up into an eldritch abomination thanks to a dip in the man-made Behelit. Shiva, as he was known in this form, was a mindless Lovecraftian beast raining hellfire down on the battlefield and named after the destroyer god from Hindu mythology. Griffith transforms himself into his released state as Femto in order to tackle the twice reincarnated apostle. But just as he goes to put Ganishka out of his misery, the chapter ends with one of the coolest cliffhangers in Berserk history. Skull Knight could give Randy Orton a run for his money with the number of times he pops up to oppose the God Hand from out of nowhere. And this instance at the end of chapter 303 is his coldest pull-up in the entire franchise. As Femto is about to place his hand on Ganishka's head and give him the comfort he has sought his entire life, we see a tear in space appear, and the tip of a rather familiar Behelit-covered sword emerges. Zod looks at his master with a look of pure horror and disbelief as he realizes just what was unfolding in front of him. The Skull Knight, using the Sword of Actuation, had torn open a spatial portal in order to catch Femto completely off guard, and it looked to Zod like he had succeeded. Chapter 303 ends with Skull Knight letting loose a space-tearing sword slash in Femto's direction, but we immediately learn that the Skull Knight had failed in his first attempt to kill a God Hand in the very next chapter, because as it turns out, Femto had anticipated this assassination attempt. As a God Hand member, he possessed a much firmer grasp over the flow of causality than most people. It's possible that he had foreseen Skull Knight's arrival at this precise moment, but there's also a cold logical reason behind his surprisingly quick reaction. He just deduced the Skull Knight's pattern of movement. Instead of being sent into the abyss by Skull Knight's surprise sword slash, Femto simply catches and manipulates it using his own spatial powers. He then surprises both Skull Knight and Zod by claiming that he was waiting for the former. He then calls Skull Knight the Knight of Skeleton, who targets the God Hand at temporal junctions, which is what we meant by old Scully Boy leaving his tracks wide open. Skull Knight only manifests within the physical world on nights of the full moon, or whenever a temporal junction point is about to reach critical mass. This explains why he hasn't been able to defeat the God Hand despite being alive for 1,000 years, because how can he fight someone when he himself doesn't physically exist most most of the time, and they don't physically exist at all. The God Hand is a massive body of thought, as Skull Knight explains in chapter 142, and so attacking them in the physical world is next to impossible when things are normal. Even when the physical and astral worlds started overlapping, as they did in Clip-Off, killing them was no guarantee, as Guts' would-be fatal stab to Slan was negated by her simply dissolving back into the astral world. Femto's incarnation into the physical world, and the temporal junction point he was building up to ever since his incarnation, was going to be the Skull Knight's best chance at physically defeating a God Hand member for the first time in his own life. But as we mentioned before, his conditional existence made his pattern of appearance predictable. Even if he wasn't a demonic angel imbued with divine powers, Griffith's tactical human mind would have made the same deduction about the Skull Knight's appearance at the time of Ganishka's demise. He decides to flex on the poor struggler and everyone else present, including us, by dropping a horrible prophecy on our heads. Femto states that one twice reincarnated and a sword stroke that reaches still deeper into the spirit world have opened the door. The reason we call this a prophecy is because looking back on the first arc of Berserk, the God Hand, specifically Femto, was pressuring the Slug Count into giving up his daughter and becoming a twice reincarnated apostle himself. Slug Count had displayed enough subservience to the God Hand for us to assume that had he accepted, he'd have been in Ganishka's place today. Because he rejected the deal, Femto ended up having to use Ganishka instead, who was a total opposite to the other apostles, outwardly opposing the God Hand and choosing to fight them despite being subservient to them being in his very nature. It's possible that the God Hand had already foreseen Skull Knight's forging of the Sword of Actuation, given that he'd been collecting Behelits for ages now, and they were simply waiting for the opportune moment. Masterfully enough, this moment is also where the sword's peculiar name ends up becoming oh so relevant. After intercepting Skull Knight's strike, Femto manipulates it and uses it to split open Shiva's head, which causes the opposite of what happens when an apostle dies. As we told you guys earlier, when an apostle dies, their souls are dragged into the abyss by other tortured souls that reside within it. But when Ganishka died, the fact that he had been reincarnated twice, artificially the second time, and he had been killed by a space-manipulating sword strike that is also a one-way trip to the abyss, caused a chain reaction of sorts, and turned that trip the other way around. Instead of being sucked into the abyss, a blinding white light flashed over the entire globe and triggered an interstice that has been labeled as mankind's true desire, Fantasia. This event is known as the Great Roar of the Astral World by the Arcana practitioners of Elfhelm, but for us, it was the moment the Sword of Actuation earned its name. Recall that definition we gave you for the word actuation at the beginning of this video? Well, turns out, the Great Roar started at the moment Skull Knight's sword strike split Ganishka's twice reincarnated head in twain. By that metric, this Behelit-coated monstrosity is a literal sword of actuation, for it was the causal agent behind the triggering of the global interstice. Having failed to get his target, Skull Knight simply warps away from the situation, reappearing at Elfhelm where he fails to mention his failure to Guts during their many conversations. As of now, we don't know where the Skull Knight is, because he was last seen trying to help the denizens of Elfhelm stay alive and in the physical world. Though we have no time frame for his return to the series, we do have the implied assurance that we will see him again, simply because the Sword of Actuation is quite literally the only thing that can end the God Hand's plans once and for all. Guts already tried using his Dragon Slayer to fight him. He could only defeat Slan's partially manifested form, and against Griffith, he was entirely useless. Femto's divine spatial powers made sure that not a single stroke from Dragon Slayer reached him while he was at Elfhelm, which has sent Guts into a spiral from which there might be no return for him. In amongst all the chaos that the Berserk crew is experiencing right now, only one man remains laser focused on the God Hand, and that's Skull Knight. However, his pattern of appearance has been dissected by the God Hand down to the last letter, so having him jump them a second time might not be such a great idea. It's the Sword of Actuation that needs to be present for the God Hand to be entombed, not Skull Knight himself, so it's possible that we might see another character wield it at some point. Maybe Serpico, Rickert, Roderick, hell, even Isidro could get that honor. Giving it to Guts isn't likely in our minds because that would just not be his style, taking another man's weapon and trying to fight his arch enemies with. He would rather want to get the job done with Dragon Slayer, so that leaves us with the question, how exactly will the Sword of Actuation defeat the God Hand if they can predict when it will show up in the story? Well, we keep an eye out for every leaping fish that breaks the current current of causality, and ultimately, we hope. Either way, it's clear that this sword is being set up as the one that will sever the thread of fate from Berserk, because once you entomb all 5 agents of causality within its own endless vortex, who else is left to carry the job forward? Does the idea of evil simply hit the reset button? Does it stop existing? And if it doesn't, what happens then? All of these questions will be for us to discuss when Berserk ends. For now, all we're certain of is that the ending to the current story will be written with a sword, not a pen, and one of the creepiest looking ones across anime history at that. Marvelous verdict. But for now, we're afraid that's all we have for you. The Skull Knight's Sword of Actuation is one of the most interesting aspects of Berserk precisely because of how rarely it appears and how immense its power is. It's the definition of a thing that's so powerful that using it might make you regret it more than leaving it lying around. And that's part of the allure. Now, all we're thinking is even if SK has this god-sealing sword, if he messes it up like last time, it will be all for nothing once again. And that's the beauty of Berserk. It will give you an answer to a question you've had for literal decades at this point, but then throw 20 more questions at you at the same time to make you even more confused than before. The Sword of Actuation is perhaps the greatest example of this phenomenon, but it isn't the only one. Let us know what's your favorite "and then it got worse" moment from Berserk, and leave your thoughts about the Sword of Actuation in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep struggling, strugglers.